What's up, guys? Welcome back to Sonic Academy. I'm Nate from Protoculture and Shadow Chronicles, and welcome back to another how to use video. Today we're talking compressors, one in particular, Presswerk from UHE. Let's dive in and check this out. Right, so here we go. This is Presswerk from UHE. Now, UHE has a pretty interesting way to approaching their plugins. Much the same as Diva, they kind of provide you with a incredibly detailed model, but not modeled after any specific hardware per se. But it's kind of designed in a way that you can kind of almost create your own sort of perfect compressor for what you're wanting to do. We're going to jump into this more detailed page in just a sec, but I wanted to just show you the special views first, because that's kind of the easiest way to get into Presswerk. Before we do that, you've got a preset browser over here. It's the typical preset browser that's inside of all of UHE's software. You have some options for favoriting, tagging presets, and so forth. But we're going to jump into this view over here first, the initialized view or the special views. You can access these from presets too. If you click this, you'll see you have options for easy compressor, vocal compressor, drum compressor, etc., etc. Now, what these are is essentially preset GUIs that contain macros with sort of preset settings for the compressor, just so that you can get into it easily without having to dial in a lot of the more advanced settings available in Presswerk. So, for example, we're going to be just using a drum loop as material for this demo. We may want to just grab a drum compressor for that, and you'll see this view pops up. And now the controls are fairly self-explanatory. You've got input, ratio, saturation, response, etc. We'll just take a listen to this. Dial up the ratio, faster compression. So pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into all the controls for this individually, but you have a number of different options here. The bus compressor as well. For example, if you wanted to do vocals or limiting, you have those options just to jump right into this and get instant results. Now, if you jump back to normal, each time you change these special views, it will reset the compressor completely. But let's take a look at the advanced mode now and kind of just run through some of the controls inside of this plugin. So starting in the beginning here, you have a few different detection modes. So the typical, firstly, you've got feed forward, which basically the detection mode is at the beginning of the compression circuit or the detection circuit. This is going to be a lot more accurate and a lot finer when it comes to detecting transients. It's the feedback mode, on the other hand, which is the second option you have, is a little bit more along the lines of your traditional analog modeled compressors. The feedback will put the detection mode at the end of the circuit, and it measures the differences between the input and the output and applies the compression accordingly. And then thirdly, you have this mode, the interactive mode, which is essentially sort of the best of both worlds. This will monitor both the feedback and the feed forward settings, but it's kind of program dependent. So if you're putting in transient heavy material like our drum loop here, it'll tend to favor the feed forward mode instead of the feedback. If you, for instance, put a vocal in that was far more stable with less transients, you'd get a little bit more of the feedback mode occurring. So the interactive mode is probably the one that you want to use unless you've got a specific reason to be using one of the other ones. You've also got a channel link dial here in the detection phase. What channel linking does, it will treat both channels the same. So if one channel has got a louder signal, that will be the one that takes preference, and the compression will be applied exactly the same to both channels according to that. By turning the channel linking off, setting it all the way to the left, they will be treated as independent channels, so essentially a compressor for the left and the right, and it will be applied differently to each of those signals. Moving along the top here as well, we've got a couple of different modes. You can link, or the default is to have channels linked over here. Now this is not the same as the channel linking. This basically just links the controls for the left and right. If you unlink that, you can have different settings for the left and right channels. And also furthermore, you can switch it into mid-side mode as well. So the unlinking is pretty handy here, as the channel 2 would then be your side content, which will allow you to compress differently on the sides and differently on the mid channels, should you see fit. So we'll link those again. DPR, this is dual phase rotation. So this essentially, digital compressors tend to leave phase intact most of the time, but analog compressors, they often, an analog compressor's response is often a little bit more and can actually adjust the phase and things like that. This basically, the DPR, to sort of condense it down to its simplest form, is going to change the phase in the low, mids and sub frequencies accordingly. Without getting into too much detail, this can give you a bit more punchy lows, a bit more punchy, like for kicks, for example, it'll be a little bit more punchy in that area. It also compensates a little bit for the low frequency loss when you're compressing a signal as well. I will say the one thing that you do need to remember with this, though, is when you're using this, because of the phase being adjusted slightly, you don't want to be using this mode when in parallel, as the original dry signal would have the phase intact, and the rotated phase, when this is turned on, can cause issues. For this to work as well, you're also going to want to make sure that the signal that you're putting in is fairly clean. It needs to be intact. Distorted signals going with this DPR are generally not a good idea. Can end up sounding quite bad as opposed to it being turned off. So make sure that the content you're putting in is clean when you are enabling that. And just on the right hand side, you've got some mix controls. So you can internally do parallel compression here just by using the dry wet controls. You've got your master level out. You have a high pass filter as well, so if you are doing some heavy compression, you can roll that off, leave your lows intact. If we enable the high pass filter, see, as we mix that back in, we can have just the highs being compressed heavily and then roll off the bottom end as well at the output stage. You've also got an expand button here. This enables downward expansion on the outputs as well. This will kind of help just create a slightly more lively signal out of Presswerk, right up to the point that it can create sort of almost gated effects on the transients. We're going to move down into this panel. Here you've got an input and output control for the compression stage itself. You've also got a soft clip circuit that you can enable down at the bottom here. So this is going to basically be where you're controlling the input into the actual compression circuit and then the output accordingly. You can also adjust the level over here post this output here. Now these controls here, the threshold, ratio, attack and release, these are all pretty standard. They should be fairly self-explanatory. Obviously reducing the threshold and increasing the ratio will increase the amount of compression that you're doing. The attack and release times, obviously the amount of time it takes to reduce the gain, and the release time being the amount of time that it takes to come back up to its original levels. But I do want to take a look at some of these other controls that they have in here, as these are quite interesting as far as tuning your compressor to your liking. The softney, this is another common control that you find in a lot of compressors. This basically just adjusts the curve at which, once the signal hits the threshold, with it immediately will adjust the gain according to your ratio. Dialing this up, turning the softney, you can see the curve basically rolls out slightly. It's a lot smoother. All the way to the left, you'll have hardening, which is an immediate response once it hits the threshold. The non-linear dial down at the bottom here, This is basically going to allow you to kind of adjust the response to suit different kind of compressor models. Analog compressors generally don't have a non-linear response, and some of them vary in the ways that they work. So by adjusting this, you can control the curve you'll see over there at which the gain reduction is applied, and adjusting it in the other way obviously will go downwards again. So you can get some different sounding compression by adjusting the non-linearity of the compression curve. Over on this side, by the attack and release, you've got the RMS window. This basically is going to interact with how the detection works. Slower levels, typically you're going to be setting this between 1 and 5 milliseconds. Lower levels will be more sensitive to transient material. Obviously, higher levels will be a little bit slower, favoring more sort of leveling. If you push it beyond sort of 5 milliseconds around here, you're going to be sort of emulating opto compressors, that lag that they have generally in their character. And conversely, if you go sort of beyond 1 milliseconds and down, you can do some more experimental, and this is sort of handy for sort of harsh limiting and stuff like that. It's going to be obviously very, very sensitive to transient material and cut them off really, really quickly. Just below that, we have an adapt control. This is linked to the release time. So this is essentially an auto release. Obviously, the more you dial this up, 100% adapt is going to be fully auto release. And you can sort of dial that back to control how much of that auto release you want. It's going to be program specific. Whatever you put in, it's going to adapt that release time to the program material that you're putting in. Now let's take a look around the bottom here as well. We've also got a sidechain section. This will enable you to fade between the internal sidechain, obviously the signal that's coming in, into the compressor that's being compressed. And then you can fade between an external signal as well. So if you enable sidechain compression in Cubase, for example, up here, you'll be able to select that sidechain by adjusting all the way to the right. Now this delay is an interesting function and quite welcome as well. What this will allow you to do is delay the sidechain signal slightly by 5 milliseconds or negative 5 milliseconds, i.e. pushing it in the other direction. What this is handy for is, say for instance, if you are using an external sidechain to sidechain a kick, for example, or to run a kick into this and have the side compressor ducking. What this will do is it'll actually, if you delay the signal to the right, you'll actually be allowed to let through 5 milliseconds of the initial kick where it won't be triggering the sidechain compression. So you can kind of grab just little transients from the beginning to sit on top of the kick if you were bringing that in. Conversely, if you were having those transients coming in and you wanted to just make sure that they're not happening, you can shift that in the other direction so that the sidechain coming in will actually trigger slightly earlier to make sure that there's nothing coming through on top of the kick that you are bringing into the plugin. You've also got some filtering down at the bottom here. You can enable this 12 dB filter, and you have a high pass and a low pass filter. Typically, if you are compressing a kick, for example, you may want to roll off some of these subs so that you don't get too much of the low dropout when using sort of high ratios on a kick, for example. Moving over here, we've also got a saturation circuit. You can set this to pre or post compression. The amount obviously dials in, it's kind of like the drive, it'll dial in the amount of saturation. The dynamics, this is interesting. This will basically, leaving it down at the bottom, it'll be this sort of standard, the amount that you push through, it'll be sort of uniform. If you start dialing up the dynamics, essentially the effect that you're going to get is when you drive this, it's going to be affecting only the compressed signal. So if you're applying, we can actually test this out quickly. If we're not applying any compression and we turn up the dynamics all the way and we add in quite a bit of saturation, you can see there's almost nothing happening there currently. if we dial in some compression and take a look at the saturation now, you can see there's considerably more drive happening there now. So this is quite handy for tuning that to only the compressed signal that's coming in, or only the gain reduction that's happening there is going to be saturated. And if we turn the compressor off again, turn the release back down and dial the dynamics back, you'll see the saturation kicking in without the compression. You can see obviously that now there's a lot of saturation occurring there. The warmth dial, this is basically going to actually shift the saturation up the frequency spectrum, so it's going to be affecting the highs more. This is not going to make it brighter. What it's going to do is it's going to allow the lows through without being distorted at all. And obviously applying saturation to the high frequency stuff generally kind of makes it slightly duller, which gives you that warmer tone to it. We can take a listen to that as well. You can hear turning there to the right, the lows are now staying intact. There's no real crunch happening in the low frequencies at all. It's all being reserved for the high frequencies. And lastly, in the controls, we've got a monitor for the sidechain. If we switch this over to internal, you'll be able to monitor the sidechain input. Obviously, we've got our filters on now, so you can hear exactly what's going on there. And with the filter on like that, obviously now only the highs are going to be compressed. The lows are going to be left intact. So we can apply some extreme compression there and you'll be able to hear that. There you can hear the lows dropping out because we've taken off the high pass filter. So that pretty much covers the basics on how to use this. As you can see, it's quite in depth and you can get some very different kind of responses from this by tweaking the settings. I suggest that you go through some of the presets because they have got quite a generous amount of presets here. Typically, I'm not a huge fan of using presets for compressors because obviously your program material is always going to be very varied. But in this case, you may want to go and check out, for example, you have a few in this vintage mode here, you've got a few different compressor models that you might actually recognize. See the SSL 4000 bus compressor, the 1176, there's an LA2A. Now these are, Fairchild as well. Now these are not specifically modeled after these compressor models, but they are tuned to follow a similar response. So by selecting a Fairchild, for example, we can then dive in here and just take a look at how some of the settings have been applied. RMS window coming down there. Look at the non-linearity of the compressor curve, and so on. So I would suggest, go through some of these. Take a look at the bus glue as well and have a look at the differences. See, obviously a very different frequency, compressor response dialed in there, being quite centered, that dial. RMS window much tighter. The 4000 typically does have a very snappy response, so this is kind of in line with that. So you can see how using these controls can really kind of give you a ton of control over how you want your compressor to behave. And if that's a little bit over your head, there's always the easy special views that you can dial in. So overall, an incredibly versatile compressor in typical UHE fashion. It's got a very authentic feel to it without it being a one-to-one copy of any of these sort of popular compressors. It gives you a whole lot of flexibility for using in your projects. So yeah, definitely go check this one out. If you're looking for a single compressor rather than buying a whole number of them, this may be the one that you want to go check out just because of its flexibility, and definitely a quality plugin to add to your collection. Right, I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. I will catch you guys again soon right here at Sonic Academy. Cheers.
Thanks everybody for watching, commenting and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content, and if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.